Dauntless is a constantly updating game, and some of these updates bring changes to the meta, or most effective tactic available when killing behemoths. Through the constant stream of updates, it's important to stay informed on how to kill your behemoths in the most effective manner. Join us as we go through the meta weapons, armors, cells, and more. This is your Dauntless meta update. Hello everyone, TheMrTrails here, and a happy new year 2023 to all of you. I've decided we're going to do this new format every now and then to go over what has updated, what has changed in Dauntless metagame. Since people leave and come back, this sort of series would be a way for people to stay informed. And I'll only really need to make an update to this video when there is something new that comes out and changes the metagame drastically in some way. So this series could happen as often as every update, or it could simply just be every few months or so. But drop a like for me, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and let's get into it. Let us begin with the meta weapon classes. That is the type of weapon you are bringing to your fights. This one is pretty simple, and it's anything except for chain blades and axe. This is because chain blades and axe are simply just not on par with the other weapons. Axe is more okay in the hunting grounds, where you can constantly stay at level 4 of determination meter. This brings it almost in line with the other weapons, but for other forms of hunting, it's just a bit too slow. And chain blades are still unfortunately in a state of trading extra DPS for damage. But each of the other 5 weapons can all be the #1 option depending on what you are fighting. Warpike is particularly good against behemoths with the tough hide modifier, as well as being necessary for a squad to reach maximum DPS. This is because of the Savage Wellspring special and the Munitions Amplifier modifier being able to give you 33% crit chance for everyone in the squad. Sword is able to catch up with the other weapons due to the Charged Sword Focus modifier, but this requires your behemoths to be relatively less mobile. It's perhaps the hardest weapon strategy to play at peak efficiency, so it's usually reserved for Dauntless Trials and nothing much else. Hammer is particularly good against longer, less mobile behemoths, mainly the ones where, with the extended clip modifier, all 6 shells of the Aether Slam are going to hit, as well as when you're able to effectively use the Molten Edict, which is a particularly strong hammer and arguably the best single weapon in the game. And the more consistent weapons when it comes to being meta are the Strikers and Repeaters. Strikers are rather solid for their mobility, blunt type boosted stagger damage, as well as boosted part damage, easily staggering things and keeping things down when they have the opportunity, but still being quite evasive when they don't have that opportunity. And Repeaters are very consistent when it comes to their DPS output, as each one of their hits has the same amount of damage, so wherever your crits are placed doesn't really matter. With the Marksman Chamber and Captain's Grip, you can boost the damage and attack speed for every member of a squad, but they are also rather solid in solos, especially when you're able to make use of the Precision Sights modifier. And the main weakness it has compared to the other weapons is the lack of stamina usage, meaning you can't really utilize Adrenaline for this weapon. But when Adrenaline isn't particularly good against a behemoth, Repeaters often find themselves as the #1 option. So Strikers, Repeaters, Warpike, Hammer, and Sword all have their place at the top of the Dauntless meta. This is mainly in a speedrunning context, mind you, so if you're playing casually, Chain Blades and Axe are not that far behind if you want to play those instead. In fact, most players will never reach the skill level where your weapon choice is actually going to matter. But we are talking about meta in this video, so we have to exclude Chain Blades and Axe from the equation. Next up, we have Omnicells. And Omnicells are currently in a bit of a hierarchy, if you will, and they are not very balanced with one another. The hands down best Omnicell in almost every situation currently is Revenant. Pair crazy burst damage with a sustained overtime damage boost, and you're kind of going to get that. It's even better comparatively in the more casual game modes where behemoths don't really get to do anything, because the only other Omnicell that is going to have a chance of catching up with it needs the behemoths to do some form of attack here and there. This other Omnicell is Discipline, and it often requires a bit tighter gameplay as well as a longer fight in general to be better. You need to be able to use at least half or even more of a discipline state, and this often doesn't line up with most Dauntless Trials anymore. The main one that does come to mind is Bloodshot Shroud, which is just an insanely long trial, where you could even enter and exit the discipline state and the thing still wouldn't be dead yet. Those are the 2 best Omnicells, and for a squad you're most likely going to be running Revenant, as well as 1 or 2 of the Artificer Omnicell. Artificer is a very versatile Omnicell, and the mark function that allows your teammates to deal extra damage to a behemoth part is the most useful when we're talking about a speedrun, of course. It's not quite worth it for solo DPS, but it is worth it for a squad. And the other Omnicells are just plain not meta. The only time the Bastion Omnicell would be the best is in Radiant Escalation with the Skarn Lantern, where you can get the Skarn's Defiance Amp, and this combination allows you to one-shot a lot of behemoths. But it's only a 1% chance to get, so when you factor in all of the runs where you don't get it, it's still loses compared to other meta Omnicells. Tempest is kind of fun, but it also requires dodging as well as building for movement speed. The movement speed in the build only makes your Omnicell activation more powerful, rather than making every other hit you do more powerful with other damaging cells. It does get a nice blanket attack speed bonus as well, but it's not quite enough to make it meta. It's not insanely far behind Discipline and Revenant though, and some Trials players even use it when they are playing casually. And finally is Iceborne, where DPS wise it is the bottom of the barrel. Using Iceborne as your Omnicell is a survivability choice, but past a certain skill threshold the game really doesn't make players die, so Iceborne isn't really necessary for those players. It's only really recommended for early game players, and even then you might want to try playing without it so you don't develop a dependence on it, because the game can actually become much easier if you just play the riskier meta playstyle. Next, we'll talk about the Lantern meta. Lantern choice often doesn't come down to what Lantern specifically does the most DPS, it is more about what utility the Lantern provides for the build to do more DPS. Though this is mainly because the top DPS lanterns aren't exactly convenient. The Embermane Lantern technically does the most DPS out of any lantern in any situation, however it comes with a steep drawback of having to wait 5 seconds for it to explode. This long wait often leads to misses, and often means that it's not worth running over any other lantern. The lantern with the second highest damage, the Broadsides Lantern, succumbs to the same fate, though you only have to wait 1 second for it to explode. Its main utility is interrupting, and that's really only a useful utility when it comes to repeaters. And even then, repeaters often don't use it, as they just structure the strategy around not interrupting the behemoth in the first place. So the main two lantern options are used mainly because of their utility. You'll often see the Pangar Lantern in Dauntless Trials, as it is easy access to the Frost Elemental effect. This creates longer stuns and more DPS output from the Overpower cell. And the other main lantern used is the Skarn Lantern. This is because shields are good for Galvanized, giving you extra crit chance, as well as the more general use case of keeping you alive while you are using Revenant. The Drask Lantern is also a niche utility option, good for longer behemoths, as well as getting shock elemental effects faster. And the Koshai Lantern does have an absurd amount of lifesteal, but again, Unga Bunga, aka this isn't meta. And the Strike Lantern is now mostly out of favor. Even in Dauntless Trial squads, they typically don't use it, because the shield and crit chance from Galvanized is more valuable most of the time. And in squads, you typically have the repeater bonus attack speed, as well as the wound damage bonus attack speed, and usually that's enough to make the Strike Lantern not really necessary. Next up, we are going to talk about perks and cells. Perks are the main way you increase your DPS, and ideally you have a full perk summary of 36 perks that allows you to focus on DPS. Ideally, to perform at peak DPS, 99% of builds are going to run some combination of these cells. Adrenaline, sometimes with Endurance, Berserker, Overpower, Cunning, Galvanized, Predator, Pulse, Assassin's Frenzy, Evasive Fury, and then Savagery for wounding builds. And on rare occasions, we might have Tenacious or Rage. And those are the cells that aren't a part of the Insight or Utility cell family. For Insight or Utility cells, you are going to be forced to have a +3 cell slot of this on your build. And generally, this is going to be the most that you want on a build, except for when you are running the Catalyst cell. And the Catalyst cell is by far the #1 Insight cell option. However, this does require the use of tonics to do anything to increase your DPS, which can get a little bit expensive, especially in the early game. So there are many players who will opt to not use tonics at all, and instead of Catalyst be running some other Insight cell. The general best option in this case is Molten. This is mainly for its attack speed uptime. There are other Insight cells that can be useful depending on what situation you're in. Energize can be useful when running Sword. Conduit can give your entire team some attack speed, but you mainly want to be using that if you are running the Catalyst and Aether Drive tonic anyway. And Etheric Attunement or Evasion can be useful when needing a cooldown reduction on your Lantern specifically. And the Engineer cell can be useful when needing a little bit of extra range on pylons. And because somebody is going to ask, no, Omnisurge and Cascade are not meta, and quite frankly are a waste of your cell slots. With the context of what cells are meta, we can discuss what armor pieces are meta. We're usually looking for things with a good built-in perk as well as a good cell slot, and we are typically avoiding the defensive cell slots and the utility cell slots. On screen now are going to be the top options for your armor pieces, and what I would generally recommend power surging first. We have the Koshai chest piece, the Koshai feet, the Scrave chest piece, the Scrave feet, the Rezakiri chest piece, the Timeweave helmet, chest piece, gloves, and boots, as all of those are meta, the Stormclaw gloves, the Shroud helmet, the Torgadoro gloves, the Chronivore feet, the Malkarian gloves, the Thrax chest, and the Thrax boots. And then the Quillshot chest can be used for meta wounding builds. And here are some additional options that can sometimes be used here and there. We have the Tragic Echo exotic helmet, the Thrax helmet, Embermane gloves, Boreas feet, Charog feet, Karabak helmet, Savit feet, the Charog gloves, the Rezakiri helmet, Rezakiri gloves, the Shroud chest piece, and then we have the Pangar feet, which are are more for the early game but are worth mentioning. Any other armor piece usually has some flaw or another that makes it not really see much play. And for the more defensively oriented builds, you can use some of the Nasher gear, but the Dauntless meta is about monkey-brained Unga Bunga, so these aren't exactly meta. Next up, we have consumable items. Consumable items will be necessary for top DPS and are the main reason that Catalyst is used. Your consumable loadout almost always is boiled down to 3 items. It's the Aether Drive Tonic, Blitz Tonic, and Frenzy Tonic. The Aether Drive Tonic allows for 100% uptime on your lantern, the Blitz Tonic gives you extra attack speed, and the Frenzy Tonic gives you extra damage. And this is what you're going to be running like 99% of the time. But there are some cases where something else ends up being meta. For one person of a squad and in specific solo circumstances, the Inspiring Pylon can be used in place of the Aether Drive Tonic. This will give anyone standing in it an additional damage bonus. And in some cases, this additional damage does outweigh the need for extra lantern holds. And there are 2 other consumables that can every now and then sneak into the meta. They are the Wound Damage Tonic and the Stagger Damage Tonic. The Wound Damage Tonic is going to be used by a Warpike player in a squad most likely, and one player of a squad can run the Stagger Damage Tonic if otherwise the stagger would come much later than it needs to, or if it can help to keep the behemoths down for longer. And the Stagger Damage Tonic can be particularly meta when it comes to the Gauntlet game mode, as those behemoths don't have a stagger shield that prevents them being staggered for a time after they've been staggered, and any other consumable items are mostly unused. Grenades are pretty bad damage value for having to bring them along, and anything else is mainly defensive oriented, which again, Unga Bunga, baby. And the final thing we are going to go over today are the weapon unique effects. Weapon unique effects are, as the name would suggest, a unique benefit you get from using that particular weapon. And your exact weapon choice is often going to depend on what element of weapon you need. So we'll go over the best weapons and unique effect choices for each element. For neutral weapons, the best of them are the Nasher weapons. However, this isn't saying much, as the Nasher weapons are pretty bad compared to anything with an element. So really, the only reason to use a neutral weapon is for a bounty or for your damage masteries. So let's go ahead and talk about the elemental weapons. For each element except for neutral, there is a legendary weapon which you obtain from escalations. And the best weapon to equip for any element is going to be these legendary weapons. This is because they have prismatic cell slots and they allow you to have any cell of any type inside of them. They also come with a legendary weapon ability which you can use once per fight or on a decently long cooldown. And on top of that, you can bond the regular weapons of that element to that legendary weapon, allowing them to gain the unique effects of those weapons. So essentially, legendary weapons are a strict upgrade of the best weapon of that element. So let's talk about the best weapon unique effects to use when bonding to your legendary weapon. For blaze weapons, it's somewhat of a tie between the Charog and Hellion weapon bonds. For the faster hitting weapons, the Hellion unique effect typically wins here, and for slower, stamina heavy weapons, the Charog unique effect is typically going to win here. The Hellion weapons do win in general because they have a couple of distinct advantages over the Charog weapons though. Number 1 is their perk summary. Hellion weapons have the Overpower perk, whereas Charog weapons are stuck with the Aether Hunter perk. And second is the Hellion weapon synergy with the Pulse Cell, as if you are able to line up your Hellion unique effect usage with the guaranteed crit from Pulse, this is going to create a massive DPS increase, especially when you do this on attacks that have a high base damage value. And for Hammer specifically, the Molten Edict exotic is going to be the best Blaze Hammer option. For Frost weapons, this is going to depend on if you are using the Aether Drive Tonic with Catalyst. If you are, then the Frostwolf unique effect is going to be the best option. If you are not, then the Pangar or the Boreas weapon is going to be better. Pangar is better for pretty much every weapon except for sword, where Boreas is better. And the Silver Sword that was only available for a limited time is going to be better than the Boreas sword. And in some cases, the Silver Sword can also prove to be better than the Frostwolf sword, with the main advantage being you don't have to use the Aether Drive Tonic for the Silver Sword, as well as the bonus HP that you gain from the Silver Sword is going to give you more value out of Revenant. For Radiant weapons, all of the unique effects actually have their use cases. When running the Aether Drive Tonic, the Illyria unique effect is technically the best in DPS. However, it falls prey to the same issues as the Embermane Lantern. It takes 3 seconds to explode. Even in Dauntless Trials, it typically isn't used in favor of the Resicure unique effect for the better perk economy. But the Resicure unique effect is going to be better at lower HP values, but the Valimir unique effect is going to be better at higher HP values. If you like to play off meta a little bit and use the Tough Cell plus Tenacious for your damage perhaps, at 1600 HP, Valimir unique effect is always going to be better than the Resicure unique effect, and it is usually better even at the base 1100 HP. However, for it to be better, you have to not be using the Revenant Omnicell, and if you are using Revenant, then the Resicure unique effect is going to be better. Umbral is the easiest element for this, as the Riftstalker bond is almost always going to be better than the Shroud bond. A constant 30% or more damage bonus is going to be better than a sometimes active 50% damage bonus, and with Revenant being the most meta Omnicell, you aren't going to be able to stay at this low amount of HP for the Shroud unique effect to still be effective. The Terra Element weapons are also an easy one, and that is going to be the Karabak weapons for every weapon. The Koshai unique effect makes you stop dealing damage, and that's not good for DPS. And I think technically the Fenrir unique effect can be good, it's just way too inconvenient to use. And finally, for the Shock Element weapons, the Savit unique effect is usually going to be the best option. It has a high DPS output and is easily the best shock unique effect in general. In rare circumstances, namely on the Skarn Dauntless trial, you might opt for the Drask unique effect, but only on weapons with extra damage to the head. The extra damage to the tail is mostly unwanted. So that is it. That is your Dauntless meta update. For updating this in the future, I will most likely just make edits to the audio of this video, as well as some additional graphics here and there if something new becomes meta. But that's going to do it for your Dauntless meta update of January 2023. Thank you guys for watching. Once again, drop a like for me and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And I have been Trevor. I go by TheMrTrails, and I will catch you guys next time.